This CPU had the potential to legit dominate budget gaming PC builds, but nobody is talking about it, and honestly kinda rightfully so. This here is the brand new 4-core and 8-threaded Ryzen 3 4100, and if you do a quick scroll on YouTube right now for Ryzen 3 4100 reviews, there's like barely anyone covering this CPU, and after our own testing, I can completely see why. Let's quickly backtrack though, and before just shaming AMD for this subpar launch, let's remember that AMD is very capable of dominating the budget PC build market with these Ryzen 3 CPUs. Back in April of 2020, when the Ryzen 3 3100 and even the 3300X launched, those were complete market disruptors because there was absolutely nothing that could compete with it for a $100 CPU. Granted, the 3100 and especially the 3300X were a little tricky to find, but the 3100 is honestly like a top 3 CPU in terms of price to performance during its launch time, at least during the span of me making videos, and it looks like AMD tried to repeat the same success here. The 4100 is coming in at the same MSRP as well, but it's also rocking the same weird stock issues. Right now, if you search on Amazon, you'll only find this quote-unquote $100 CPU for like $145 with $16 for shipping, and for that price, you should definitely just keep on scrolling past it. So far, everything is looking the same between the 3100 launch and this 4100 launch, but where things differ is that even if this 4100 went down to the actual MSRP pricing, I still wouldn't recommend it.
But real quickly before we start building, if you're watching this video and you're thinking, Zach, I don't want to see so many budget components, I want to see the true baller stuff, I got you covered with today's sponsor, which is the Corsair 5000T case. I'm not kidding around when I say that this case is for the true ballers only, because although it's rocking a $400 price tag, it's absolutely loaded up with the features. To start, there's 208 individually addressable RGB LEDs, which can be completely customized through Corsair's IQ software. The case comes with the Commander Core XT, which can connect even more RGB components and PWM fans. And speaking of which, there are 3 LL120 RGB fans that are pre-installed up at the front. I'm a huge fan of this super unique assault rifle barrel design up at the top with the diffused lighting. That looks so clean. And there's also a ton of storage options in the back for both 3.5-inch and 2.5-inch drives. And there's also a ton of USB ports up at the top as well. The Corsair 5000T comes in black or white options, as you can see here, and you can click that first link down in the description to learn more. But now let's get back to building my not so baller gaming PC.
Continuing on the AMD trend of cutting features to hit specific price points over the last year, i.e. the 6500 XT and 6400 graphics cards, they aren't stopping now, and they decided that the 4100 should only be compatible with PCIe Gen 3 and not Gen 4. When you realize that the 3100 from 2 years ago supports Gen 4 and also has 4 times more L3 cache, it becomes pretty apparent that this is a terrible move, but even if it did have Gen 4, it's still competing against the actual $100 Intel i3 12100F. I've said in so many videos at this point that the 12100F is absolutely dominating budget builds right now, and even though you can definitely get an AM4 motherboard for cheaper than an LGA 1700 motherboard, the 12100F is going to get my vote any day of the week. The 12100F is also readily available at its MSRP pricing, and it even goes on sale down to just $90 sometimes at places like Micro Center, and at that point it becomes a no-brainer for any new budget build. With the actual price that the 4100 is sitting at, $145 plus shipping, it's now competing with the 12400F, which has 6 performance cores, and the 12400F is on a completely different island than the Ryzen 3 4100. So to recap, AMD cut features again on this budget Ryzen 3 chip, and with the terrible pricing and terrible stock issues, there's honestly just not a lot to love about this CPU. I do want to quickly loop back to the PCIe Gen 3 though real quickly. The reason that this is really bad, outside of the simple concept of cutting basic non-cutting edge features, is that on paper the 4100 would have been a really nice pairing with something like the 6500 XT, but you obviously just can't do that. We all already know at this point that if you're using Gen 3 with the 6500 XT or 6400, you're going to lose a significant amount of performance, and that's a huge shame because without that being a factor, the 4100 would have paired very well with it. If you can get the 4100 for its $100 MSRP, a $200-ish 6500 XT, and then pair that with a budget B450 motherboard for like $50, that would have been a monster price to performance combo for budget builds. The fact that you can't pair the 4100 with the $200 6500 XT is honestly just more sad than anything. AMD really dropped the ball on this one, especially for us true budget builders. Now, before we completely write off this CPU, there's a couple of positives that I do want to quickly mention before we start cranking some numbers with the benchmarks. The first point is that the 4100 is actually just a tad bit lower performing than the Ryzen 5 3600, and since you can't usually find the 3600 for a decent price, on paper this is actually a solid price to performance win. When the 3600 launched at $200 a few years ago, it was really tough to use anything else for mid-range builds, so the fact that we have a similar option now for $100 to $130 is definitely a welcome treat, albeit with 2 less cores and 4 less threads. The other typical feature is that the 4100 is unlocked for overclocking, as you would expect. I personally didn't do any of this testing myself, but for those of you that are interested in getting a few free extra FPS, then you do have that option with the CPU. And finally, the number one benefit of all Ryzen CPUs is that you have the ability to pair them with some ultra cheap motherboards. You don't need a high-end X570 or B550 board with the 4100. A cheap B450 board will do just fine, and you can usually find them for like $30 to $40 on places like Amazon Warehouse. You also don't really have a solid upgrade path now that AM4 is almost a dead platform. For the last 5 years, we've definitely taken it for granted that you can essentially upgrade any Ryzen-based system pretty easily, but now that AM5 is coming out later this year, that's not really a feature to consider with Ryzen builds here in mid-2022. All in all, before even getting into the numbers, I personally don't think the Ryzen 3 4100 would make sense to anybody no matter what your budget is. The only time it would really make sense is that if you already have an AM4 motherboard and you're looking for an upgrade from something like a first-gen Ryzen 3 or Ryzen 5, or maybe you're one of those people that likes to build all AMD systems. You could also be in a region where the 12100F pricing doesn't make sense. I can only ever talk about the pricing here in the United States, and here the 12100F is just too powerful right now for any other $100-ish chip to compete with it. But just in case if you do find yourself with the 4100 or you're thinking about buying one, let's run the numbers to see how it'll pair with some different graphics cards. For today's testing, I picked 3 GPUs that I think would be the best pairings with the 4100. They ironically happen to all be Gigabyte Eagle cards, which you know I personally hate the aesthetics of, but these cards are the RX 6600, RX 6600 XT, and the RTX 3060. I don't think we had any CPU bottlenecking with any of these cards, so the 4100 may even be able to pair with cards a little bit higher end than this, something like the 3060 Ti or the 6700 XT. For our testing runs today, we built this, honestly surprisingly good looking PC, and we definitely need to take a quick tour of it. I tried to match the aesthetic of these Gigabyte Eagle cards because we will be selling this build with one of them on my website, and honestly, I'm super happy with how this turned out. Other than the 4100 and graphics cards, first up we have the MSI B550-A Pro motherboard. There's 16 gigabytes of XPG Spectrix RGB D60G RAM clocked at 3600 MHz, and the SSD is the WD Blue SN570 500GB NVMe. Everything is inside the NZXT H510 Flow, again because I bought a few of these on a really solid $80 sale, and this time we tried out some new Rgb fans from Glid, and they're actually really solid. A 5-pack of these costs $50, which is definitely a bit more than the cheaper fans, but they honestly look really clean, can be controlled from the remote control, and yeah, they just have a nice aesthetic, especially for mesh front panels like this one. Here's what the final parts list is looking like, and with these Formula Mod silver, gray, and blue extensions, this PC is really dialed in when talking about the aesthetics, but let's see how it performs with other various GPUs. Starting with the obviously popular Elden Ring, here are the results we got for all 3 GPUs in 1080p with high settings. As you can see, the 6600 XT and RTX 3060 did right around the same performance, which is a touch better than the 6600. Next up was Halo Infinite, and here we can see the 3060 scale a little bit past the 6600 XT, but still pretty solid numbers for all 3 cards with this more of a demanding game. Apex Legends followed up after that, and here we see a little bit of an increase in the 6600 XT compared to the 3060, but remember that there's always room for error, and testing games like Apex Legends is extremely tough to do consistently. Fortnite trailed after that, and for the next remaining games, I'll shut up for a few seconds and let you see the rest of these benchmarking results for yourself, and then we'll finish talking about them. So yeah, we definitely got some really solid numbers with all 3 of those graphics cards, and the 4100 didn't appear to hold any of them back. If you somehow found yourself with a Ryzen 3 4100, an RX 6600 XT, or RTX 3060 system, you would still have a very capable gaming PC, but if you're building one from scratch, the pricing of the 4100 just doesn't make a whole lot of sense for most people. If you are interested in seeing how the 4100 compares against the 12100F that I keep praising, in our last Flip and Friday episode where I built this PC, we actually used the 12100F and a different RTX 3060 3060, and we can steal the benchmarks of that video to compare with this one. Remember that this isn't a true apples to apples comparison, as we are using a different RTX 3060 model, the RAM kit is different, etc, but here's a quick chart showing the differences of the 4100 and 12100F using an RTX 3060. As you can see, all of these titles did a good bit better with the 12100F, including that 8% increase on time spy, and since the 12100F actually costs $90 to $100 and the 4100 costs around $160 right now, these two just aren't comparable. If you want to see a little bit more in-depth benchmarking analysis, then be sure to check out Random Gaming in HD's recent video of the 4100, but spoiler alert, him and I essentially have the exact same viewpoints of the CPU, although it does seem that he has a little bit better pricing over in the UK. Be sure to let me know what you think of the Ryzen 3 4100 down in the comments section, but if you are looking for a CPU and GPU combo that I actually recommend, then feel free to click the video that's on the screen now.